back on the Paddle and Portage Podcast with one of our famous now, even though it's like our second or third one, famous in our mind, fireside chats on the podcast. And today we're with Joe Whitson. He's the author of this book that I've talked about on our social media pages for Paddle and Portage, Marketing the Wilderness. Is like the subtitle actually part of it, or do you just call it Marketing the Wilderness?
Just a descriptor, yeah. Marketing the Wilderness is fine. Outdoor recreation, indigenous activism, and the battle over public lands.
And Joseph Whitson, it says, but Joe is how he's been referring to you all day. I hope
Right, Joe,
that's
yep.
right. So yeah, this book has made a significant impact on me this summer, and talking with other people about wilderness concepts and things that you analyze and bring question to in this book. So if we could, just before we get into things, like how would you describe this book? If somebody's like, what was your book about that you wrote? Like, what would you tell them in that?
I feel like I give a different answer to every audience that I come to. But the book is about our relationship with the natural world, and it's about the ways that representation, especially marketing, especially outdoor recreation marketing, have shaped the way that we understand our relationship to the natural world, the way that we understand our public lands, and in many ways the way public lands policy has been written. And then it's also about the pushback to that, right? And so it's about the ways that indigenous people have encountered this representation of wilderness as pristine, as natural, as untouched, and push back against that representation in very concrete ways.
Okay. So you it's not just a light read.
It's not a light read, no.
Right? I mean, we can definitely say that. It took me, actually we were up at Rockwood Lodge earlier today and doing some paddling around on Poplar Lake and just kind of getting in a canoe to spend some time getting to know each other a little bit more before we had this conversation. Carl Madsen, one of the owners, says, we were talking to him, hey, this is Joe, and he wrote this book, that being you. And he says, oh, is that a quick read? And I was like, no. And he was just kind of like taking him back. I don't know why he was, but that was just an immediate reaction. Like there's a lot of critical thinking involved to read the book. And I think to break it down and not to give away too much about the book itself is let's start with a song that you talk about in the book.
Right.
Woody Guthrie song from the 1940s, This Land Is Your Land, and how that song, which is used by outdoor retail and also like businesses that sort of advocate for wilderness and outdoor space, public land, and politicians, Bernie Sanders, Ronald Reagan, that a lot of people have used that Woody Guthrie song to kind of motivate and grab the attention of and illustrate, like, these are our public lands as Americans.
Right.
To utilize, and here's the soundtrack for that.
Right.
But you raise question to that in the book.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this song is used everywhere. In advertisements, you wouldn't even really think it's applicable, but it's really become part of American identity. And it was actually for a while considered to be a replacement for our national anthem, just because of how universally beloved it is. It speaks to a welcoming nation. It speaks to kind of a sense of pride and ownership over our country. But not everybody agrees, right? And so, for example, this was used in the Biden inauguration, and immediately after that, there was some pushback against it.
Jennifer Lopez.
Jennifer Lopez saying it.
Yeah.
But when we think about our land, there's a group of people that for whom the who is the R is really a question that comes up, and this is the indigenous people of the United States. And so if you start looking at that song through a lens of indigenous people and through a lens of colonialism, all of a sudden it becomes a song that is that's got a whole other side to it, right? Who is the R in our land? What does R mean, right? What does it mean to possess land, and how did we come into possession of that land? So it raises a more complicated history about our public lands. And it's kind of an entry point into saying, what we believe is this universal good, this universal asset to our country came at a price. And it came at a price for Indigenous people, and it's a price that's still being paid today.
And as you explore that through the book, you use different anecdotes and examples from the creation of the national parks to wilderness areas. And wilderness areas are like 5% of the nation's land, just under 5%. So it's a significant amount of land. But that there was the removal of people from those lands, or they were utilized by people for, like, that's how this landscape was humans were a part of it,
Right.
not apart from it. And it's sort of the narrative of untrammeled wilderness and untrammeled land and untrammeled by man and so forth, which so we'll get into in a bit. But like this song, which is now sort of been captured by lots of different people and entities, as you're describing, from outdoor recreation, retail to politicians, has like is just sort of like for you raising a question of, okay, public lands, good for lots of reasons, but problematic for some reasons. What would be some of those problems? Just the fact that we have public lands, because like, what a great thing. I mean, we went out paddling today in this canoe on public land, Superior National Forest, right up to the edge of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness.
Right.
Didn't have to like make a big deal about it, get a bunch of permission from people. We just went and did it. Public land in America, cool. So what's the problem, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way we use public lands, and especially for people who are involved using for outdoor recreation, it's a very meaningful space for us. It's a meaningful space for identity and for health and public health, and there's a reason that this is an incredibly, an issue that has bipartisan support, and that is, people from all walks of life really enjoy getting out and using our public land. The difficulty is when we start digging into the history of the land, especially, and it's not just history; it's the way that history continues to impact communities today. So all public land in the United States, all land in the United States, right? I think public land, especially wilderness areas, because of the way we represent them, because of the way we talk about them, as ahistorical, as pristine, as natural, become kind of easy places to talk about the issue of colonialism in the United States. But it's true for all land in the United States. There was people here before, right? There was deep histories here before. And the way that the United States acquired these lands was often underhanded or through treaties that were failed to be upheld. Wilderness areas and public lands are part of the failure to uphold those treaties for Indigenous nations. Many treaties allow for certain resource rights. They allow for certain uses or making a living off the land in ways that are made impossible because of the laws around recreation. So it comes down to a value system, right? For example, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. This is, the wilderness nature of it is something that makes it so valuable to so many people. Being able to go canoe in it, being able to not have motorboats, being able to have it not be seen as a kind of an extractive space, right? This is a space kind of outside of the kind of money-making world of a lot of the lands in the United States. But to have those decisions made about it prevents Ojibwe uses, certain Ojibwe uses that are promised in treaties, right? So access to certain areas, more commercial uses of areas to make a living, as opposed to just touristic uses, and living in and on that space, right? Which would be possible if the treaties, if the failure to uphold those treaties then kind of, resulted in the return of these lands in certain spaces.
And when you say return, do you mean like give back the land? Or like
when people
land management?
There's a couple ways to think about this, right? So when people say land back, or if we're really thinking about treaties as the letter of the law, and what it means if you break a treaty and that it becomes null and void, that means land back. That means the full return of sovereignty of land that is now part of the United States back to Native nations. The reality of that, of course, is much more complicated because of the relationship between Native nations and the United States. this kind of protectorate status, because that even reservation lands are managed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs as trust lands. What would that look like? But when it comes to like full management and sovereignty, when we say land back, that's what it means. But there's other paths that we can think about to have maybe a more just relationship to these spaces. And one of them is co-management, bringing in people who have stewarded this land for a long time, who have deep understanding of these spaces. In many ways, in ways that land management people today are rediscovering, right? Think about fire management, think about kind of humans' integral role in keeping spaces open and accessible.
Like the bison range, or
The bison range is a great example.
in Montana.
In Montana, yeah. To bring in folks that have this experience, you know, and both have experience and lived experience and a political right to have management over this, I think is a really important first step to thinking about how can we take these existing recreational spaces and public lands and start talking about these histories and addressing these histories.
Well, so people who are very much in love with the idea of the Boundary Waters, they come up here. It's their place to go get away from the cities, and if you start talking about change and access for, you know, the people living in Minneapolis, and let's just say, you know, like white people living in Minneapolis, which is the majority of the people that go to the Boundary Waters, you start telling them that they're not maybe going to be able to do that. That's going to change. There's going to be some upheaval, maybe even a bit of chaos involved in something like that. I mean, are you suggesting that access would change for like the average Boundary Waters paddler?
Yeah, I mean, access is an important aspect of talking about when we talk about with management, right? For who does this land exist, right? When goes back to this is our land, right? Who is the R in this land? Certain uses of land preclude other uses of land, and if we think about, you know, treaty rights and indigenous uses, some of those uses may preclude recreationists or canoeists from using the land in the way that they use it today. That's not inevitable. It doesn't have to be either or. But the question of access is one of the things, or limited access or restricting access, is definitely something that needs to be considered when you're making these decisions, right? Do we have a right to just, you know, because of the agreements that we've made as a nation, have a right to be able to use the land in any way we want? It's a question that needs to be brought up, and it's a question that needs to be brought up in discussion with kind of the Native nations who have these rights and who have these retained privileges in these spaces.
Okay, so as like the Wilderness Act of 1964 is being crafted and shaped, and there's some earlier things that played into like the setup to that, like roadless area legislation and so forth, and then now we're talking about like the Wilderness Act of 64. So we're getting into like Sigurd Olson and Leopold and these types of towering figures when we're talking about conservation and wilderness. And for our purposes here in, you know, canoe country, definitely Sigurd Olson
Right.
is at the top of that. And so they were doing that, you know, making that push to protect these places. And the gentleman, Howard, who wrote the Wilderness Act, Howard Zenith, or what's his
Zahn.
Yeah.
Is it Zahner?
Yeah.
I should know this.
Howard Z? Is it Howard? Is that even right?
Zahn. We'll have to look it up. I'm sorry about this. I should know my own book.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
I mean, I should know. A lot of people know. But
Yeah.
Anyway, him, right? And so Sigurd and Leopold and all the people involved in like writing the Wilderness Act, they're doing it not like they're at a crossroads for what we're going to do with these public lands in America, and how we're going to sort of set some aside that cannot be logged or mined, where extraction can have no place. And the word that he uses when he's writing it is untrammeled.
Right.
It will not be trammeled by man. You know, like
right. Not be controlled, not be you know managed, right? Like you would trammel a horse. Yeah.
Yeah, or even like, you know, not impacted. But here we are, hundreds, 50,000 people go in there and camp and so forth, and utilize the land and so forth. But it's mostly an extractive thing. So the people who are writing the Wilderness Act did that because they perhaps saw no better path forward in terms of preserving something for future generations. And we still hear that today from nonprofit organizations to the outfitters and so forth. We got to protect this place for now and future generations.
Right.
This was just like they did in '64.
Mm-hmm.
And so what would have been the alternative if we didn't set up wilderness acts and national wilderness areas, national parks, these precious lands in America? Like, what would they have done? They maybe had no choice at that time. Are you open to that idea, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, when we look back in time, and we talked about this before, when we look back in time, it's easy to say that this was inevitable, or if this hadn't been done, the other kind of inevitable option was that these would have been exploited. They would have been either filled, like we think about Niagara Falls as the example of a commercialized, exploited natural wonder, which is one of the driving forces behind the creation of national parks. Filled with resorts, filled with motorboats, filled with all of these things. When folks like Sigurd Olson were trying to preserve the wilderness character of that land, or extraction, turn into mining sites, turn into kind of what we're fearing today, right? The introduction of copper mining, things like that, into this watershed. But of course, that wasn't necessarily inevitable. There was other ideas floating around at the time, and there were other stakeholders, and there were other views of how wilderness, or how we could relate to the natural world in a sustainable way. So if you look at someone like Sigurd Olson, and I love Sigurd Olson, I think he's a poet, I've got his books, but his view was through a lens of recreation, right? I mean, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, right? Even the name of it kind of comes through this idea that this is a place that's, the use of it is, and the human relationship to it is a recreational relationship. And you see that play out in Supreme Court cases like the Bois Forte, Gottschnick versus the United States, which talks about how Indigenous people can use it, but only as tourists, right?
So a gentleman in 1998, I think, a band member from Bois Forte,
right,
Ojibwe man, used a 8-horse on a square stern on basswood, and said that I'm exercising my right to hunt, fish, and gather.
Exactly.
On this
Yeah.
territory.
Yeah. As a modern contemporary person, right, not using kind of traditional methods.
Yeah. And lost the case.
Lost the case, yeah, and he did it intentionally designed to kind of test the case, and test the law at the moment. And the court's decision was, actually, it is possible for the Ojibwe to be able to, for Bois Forte to be able to access these areas. They just, because we see thousands of tourists access these areas every year.
Same as Grand Portage,
right.
Fond du Lac.
Yep.
And people coming on a canoe trip.
Exactly, yeah. So there's this equation, it's like they can go as recreational canoers, and they can get, the state limit of fish. When really that's not reflected in what the treaty language says, or could legally be argued as said, as the Bois Forte argue it to mean. So this comes out of the spirit of Sigurd Olson in this kind of recreational space. And if you go through Sigurd Olson's writings, or some of the writings of the early Wilderness Act founders, or Wilderness Society founders, they have this idea that Indigenous people are disappearing, that they're on their way out. They're not truly considered as stakeholders in these areas. In fact, they're deeply romanticized, right? So he'll talk about visiting Cree villages, or he'll talk about the remnants of the rock art and the petroglyphs in the Boundary Waters, and these kind of mysterious pre-Voyager or Voyager era peoples that are kind of leaving, right? And Sigurd Olson and his Wilderness Society and recreators as being the natural stewards of that place, right? Who and what is their responsibility in stewarding it? Their decision was this kind of wilderness method. But of course, there were still Indigenous people in there. There were still deep connections, as there are today. Other ways of having sustainable, long-term, but multifaceted and multi-use human interactions in these spaces. So the laws could have been written with that in mind, right? While still protecting it from exploitation through tourism or exploitation through mining, but without having to result in the kind of wholesale removal of Indigenous people from those spaces, the severing of connections, and the kind of abrogation of treaty rights.
And in your research for the book, did you find that was even a talking point or a consideration? Was it intentionally avoided, or just completely absent of even consideration.
There wasn't a lot of consideration. There was the worldview at the time for a lot of these people, like the framers of this act, was that Indigenous people were kind of on their way out. And that worldview started changing as Indigenous activism kind of reemerged in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. The Indian New Deal, self-determination. There was a bunch of policies that went into place, federal policies about the relationship between tribes in the United States that kind of allowed for a resurgence of activism and a resurgence of presence of Indigenous people kind of on the political stage. But that was kind of as these formations about wilderness had already been forming. So there were things like fissions, right? So there was even before this kind of the 90s where we see the Supreme Court case, there was people in Ojibwe people in other Native nations in Wisconsin and in Minnesota and in the Pacific Northwest especially that were pushing back already against these. And so it wasn't that they needed other voices to speak for them. There were activists already there. And so to what extent were they listened to? To me, it means that there had to be an awareness that there was counter ideas and counter voices to what was happening. But the level of cooperation and stakeholder power that they had still remained very marginalized.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about you just mentioned this romanticized idea of like this, that there were Native people, Indigenous people once here
Right.
on these lands, and Sigurd and others are sort of taking that approach. And that on the front page of the newspaper here in Grand Marais, the News Herald, in like 1960, I think it was, around there, that somebody talked about the Indian princess, I think is what she was referred to, which is like a very young Native woman that died on Sag, or was like they lived on what is now Sag at the end of the Gunflint Trail, and is buried there somewhere.
Right.
And people would like go, like make pilgrimages to go
Yeah.
see this gravesite, and
Yeah.
there's like all this like I'm now deep in this wilderness thing,
Right.
and here's where Indians lived,
Yep.
and like she's buried there, like that's very intense.
Right. Yeah. One of the things I talk about in the book is that our idea of wilderness today, which generally is ahistorical, right, or empty or pristine, or very little or no human presence. That's not always how people viewed wilderness. In fact, in the early 20th century, up through about the mid-century, one of the prevailing views of wilderness was deeply associated with this romanticized view of Indianness. Not necessarily Indigenous people themselves, but the kind of ghosts of them or the presences of them, right? So that's why something like an Indian princess grave, or petroglyphs or rock art that were centuries old, like the is it North Hegman Lake petroglyphs are there.
Yeah, or south or something.
South maybe, yeah. So for canoeists, recreators going into this, those were symbols of truly being in the wilderness, right? We've left civilization because the presence of this people or the ghosts of these people signify something outside of society. But you've seen that dwindle a little bit, right? So when those type of sites are no longer what people are looking for when they're going out into the boundary waters, right? They're going for no human presence, right? They're going for, a pristine, outside of society experience. And part of that is because you'd no longer be encountering the ghosts of Indigenous people or of Indianness. You'd be encountering Indigenous people themselves, if some of these laws changed. And that's, all of a sudden you have to be confronted with modernity, and you have to be confronted with the conflict between a romanticized vision of a people and the physical reality and political reality of a people. And that kind of spoils the wilderness experience, right? As it's been marketed, as it's been portrayed, and it's been sold to a boundary waters canoer.
And you definitely analyze and critique the selling of wilderness and outdoor retail, businesses, outfitters, media. Paddle and Portage, I don't think we didn't probably exist yet, or maybe as you were finishing the book.
Right.
But you, in particular, outdoor like retail, like some of the major players, North Face, Patagonia, REI, these are sort of major companies that work hard to sell the brand of
Right.
outdoor public land. And this summer, when we came fairly close to selling some public land in Utah, and like there was a big push. I mean, this was like, we are starting to hear that phrase a lot. These are your lands. This is your public land. And it goes back to the Guthrie song and all these things. But what can you tell us about the outdoor industrial complex? I think another writer coined that term, but you definitely put some focus on that. Like, is it bad that we're marketing the wilderness? Is it bad that people are renting canoes and packs and making money off of that and putting on Instagram on the daily and so forth? Like, this could be you, and then it's a picture of someone leaving a lake off the Gunflint Trail or whatever. Like, is that a bad thing?
I mean, outdoor recreation and the businesses that support are not inherently bad, of course. But the way that the public lands as they exist now, because of how we've thought of, because we've constructed wilderness and how we've constructed ourselves in wilderness as explorers, right? As kind of figures who are escaping kind of a modern society to get into something that's more primitive or more untouched. That's a narrative that the companies rely on and they lean into to sell their products, right? So the public lands in general are kind of a necessary arena for the sports products that are sold by these companies, right? They're one of the reasons they're willing to go to bat politically for these lands in a way that they maybe haven't exercised their political power in the same way in the past before these kind of concrete threats. It's because they know how important these lands are to their bottom line. And that's, they've explicitly said, made that argument, right, in the court cases. So, for example, when Bears Ears was being reduced under the first Trump administration, Patagonia, along with a coalition of other organizations and tribes, sued the government over it. And the damages that they claimed were that it was going to hurt their bottom line, right? That these lands were a critical part of their business strategy and their money-making ability. So they understand this, right? We talked about access, right? If access changes, that's going to affect their bottom line. We talked about if the mythology about wilderness and the real deep connection that a lot of Americans have to this style of wilderness changes, you're going to have to rebuild a whole new narrative and a whole new strategy around that. So it kind of becomes this reinforcing effect for companies to portray the land as untouched, as ahistorical, as an explorable space. What that does, the downside of that is when you start looking at it through a colonial lens, right? This is a way that reinforces the exclusion of Indigenous people. It reinforces the United States not honoring treaty rights, and it's a way for the United States, if we think about the industrial complex, right, and these outdoor companies kind of role with the United States. We see a lot of threats to these lands today from the federal government, and the arguments are often around security, energy security, energy first, America first, arguments that override many of these environmental arguments, right? These economic arguments for recreation, the exploration, and we're seeing kind of threats to that. These lands have been kept in the United States' hands in the way that they are under kind of federal jurisdiction, as opposed to maybe tribal jurisdiction or mixed jurisdiction or other ways that might make it harder, because the outdoor companies, because recreation is so palatable, because it's something that so many people like. And yet, because it's still under these jurisdictions, which have proven to be pretty fragile in certain ways, as much as they're an important bulwark against, it doesn't have to be either or, it can be both at the same time, also makes them vulnerable to these contemporary threats. So if we can think about what's a way to move forward to make sure these lands are protected, is the way that we currently have in place, is that working? And we may find out in the next few years whether or not it truly is something that was working or not. But the folks at Bears Ears found out, for example, it wasn't a good strategy, and there maybe was other strategies that would have been more sustainable and stronger against these type of threats.
Mm-hmm. And so does that go to say that it's used twin metals, the proposed copper-nickel mine on
Right.
the edge of the wilderness, the Boundary Waters. It's on Birch Lake, near Ely, Quishwe River. The water flows into the Boundary Waters,
Right.
where the mine is. And so the idea for organizations that are opposed to this mine, or any individual or anybody that's opposed to it, is that if you build this mine, it could damage the wilderness, even
Right.
though the mine is outside the wilderness.
Yep.
And so that almost seems, though, separate from what you're saying about when you make reference to Bears Ears, and the fact that if they get the mine on the edge, maybe then they want to, there's another deposit just right over there, and it's in the wilderness,
Mm-hmm.
but we can just either move the boundary back
Right.
a little bit, or maybe just kind of change it altogether.
Yeah.
And I think that is the intersection of maybe some of your ideas when people read the book,
Mm-hmm.
which I hope they do, is that then can intersect with people's deep fear of opening the wilderness. And these
Right.
are like environmental advocates that would be proponents of things like more prescribed fire or indigenous use of fire in the wilderness.
Right.
Like I imagine, because it would lead to a healthier forest, be in favor of that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's
Yeah, science-backed management, yeah.
But if you open that key, unlock that chest, get inside and start
Mm-hmm.
tinkering around with the Wilderness Act, while we're in here, we're going into the cupboard to
Right.
get some crackers, and while
Yeah.
we're in here,
Here's
that's-
some rider on the bill, right? That kind of changes that.
So that's the thing. It's
Mhm.
like, if you start doing things to adjust it for like co-stewardship management, land back, however you want to
Yeah.
think of it, that you're then opening that up to possible extraction
Yeah.
industries, mining,
Yeah.
moving in. So I mean that is, as I read the book, was one of the things that gave me a bit of trepidation, or
Yeah.
made me be like, damn, Joe, you had me. I was really like with you for a while.
Yeah.
And then it was like,
Yeah, I mean, it's a strong argument, and especially in our current moment where there's a lot of holding the ground as opposed to trying to move forward on environmental issues. I can see where people are coming from. What I would say is I think there's a couple ways to think about this. One is doing nothing, is holding the ground, less risky than trying to be proactively rethinking? We think about, wilderness as, if wilderness is only wilderness if it's untouched and unpolluted, what happens when it does start to be slightly touched or slightly polluted? Does that destroy it altogether? Or can we create in policy, can we create in the laws a more nuanced version that can protect our spaces to the extent that we can protect them, as opposed to, kind of just holding the line? The other thing I would say is that the whole borderline, I like thinking about twin metals in general, right? We put something on the outside and it can contaminate the inside. That comes from a wilderness worldview in general, right? As opposed to a more integrated worldview where we say all nature and it needs to be protected in some way, where it's like we can pollute this place, this place outside of the boundary waters as much as we want.
mm-hmm.
And the only reason we wouldn't is because it might pollute this sacred place within the boundary waters.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, okay, like the outside is also sacred, and the inside is not sacred in the way we may think, right? They're all kind of, we need to have a responsible, reciprocal, relational connection to land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, take a swig of your ginger.
Yeah,
ale.
sorry.
No problem. Lots of bugs out here, It's last time when I was out here recording something like this with Rick Slatton from the Rescue Squad, we had somebody running a chainsaw, which I was just utterly convinced was destroying the recording. I kept referencing it, and this
Nobody heard
Rick,
it.
who's a great source of
Yeah.
Paddle and Portage, was like, and it's like the Red Green Show, and he was just kind of, it became like this big part of the interview, and then like as you listen, like people are probably like, what the heck are they even talking about? It's not even a thing. So
Yeah.
like, you just kind of roll with the
Yeah.
show, in
Yeah.
other words. So take any breaks you need, Joe. But
Yeah, and so then the final thing I would say about that is that these arguments around if it's kind of there's a logical fallacy built in there, right? It's like kind of a straw man logical fallacy. Like we can't make this change because if we do, we'll lose everything, right? And so it prevents action from happening.
Yep. Okay.
It's a fear-based response, and I get that because we're in a time where people are afraid that we're going to lose our wildernesses, and there's these real threats. But that if we want to move towards a more just relationship with land and one that matches our political commitments, and kind of a reimagining of our relationships and ethics towards land, we can't be afraid to touch anything about losing it. We have to, be building an activist network. We have to be building coalitions. We have to be getting people on board, so that when we do approach that, we have the power we need to be able to do it correctly, right? To be able to protect what we value about the land, about the boundary waters, and make it better, right? And make it more just, and make it more inclusive, and make it a place that acknowledges and addresses the difficult history that was part of the creation of it.
Okay. And so you do coin a term. I mentioned that outdoor industrial complex is something you kind of expanded on
Right.
and used that somebody else had originated. But you did come up with a term, and that's wildernessing. Wildernessing.
You can turn anything into a verb.
Yes.
Yeah.
And tell me the definition of that, or tell us the definition of that.
Yeah, wildernessing is it's the realization of a representation, right? So it's the way that wildernesses are created. So based on the idea of wildernessing is the idea that wildernesses aren't natural and are in fact constructed spaces that have to be carefully managed to maintain their wilderness nature, right? Created through the removal of indigenous people and removal of other things, right? You think about the boundary waters, there was resorts there were houses there was all sorts of things that were removed and pulled apart to create the wilderness as we know it today. And so we talk about how we represent land, right? Through marketing or through writing or through discourse, all the different ways that we talk about and represent land. The more we talk about it in a certain way, the more we represent, the more we believe it, the easier it is to do it because we already believe it's that way, right? So we talk about the Wilderness Act, to land that is only visited by man and who doesn't remain, that is untrammeled. There's an assumption in that wildernesses do exist, right? As opposed to, no, we have an idea of what we want land to be like, and we're going to go ahead and create that land. That's a harder political step than saying we're going to protect land as it is, when in fact that as it is until it's created is only representation only. It's a fiction. It's part of this kind of mythology of what we believe land to be. So when you say wildernessing, it's connecting how we talk, how we think, how we represent about land to the physical creation of it.
So basically, Sigurd Olson and Leopold Oberholzer sort of a little before them to an extent, but in that same kind of sort of generational time period, is like they made up wilderness. It didn't exist. They made it exist. Like wilderness is just an idea as opposed to like a tangible place that we go
Yeah,
to.
I wouldn't go so far as to say they specifically made it up, but they were definitely part of the kind of perpetuation of it. Wilderness has been an evolving concept, right? So the word wilderness, the idea of wilderness, is something that's existed for a long time, as long as the United States has existed and before.
Well, didn't it used to mean like in Old English, like a place where animals are?
Right. Yeah. So it was originally a hostile place, a place outside of civilization, which included, indigenous people at the time. And then there was a kind of a switch where all of a sudden it became a place that we needed to conquer and cultivate, right? So wilderness became we need to conquer the wilderness. We need to cultivate. We need to bring it into society. And then that's kind of the worldview that Sigurd Olson and some of these wilderness society folks were pushing against. They said, no, actually, wilderness isn't something we need to cultivate. It's something we need to protect because it's got an inherent value to it. The problem was this view it was working within a colonial system, right? So the wilderness we need to cultivate is a wilderness that's populated by indigenous people who already, have live there, right? Is it outside of society? It's outside of white settler society. It's not outside of indigenous society. It is indigenous society. These kind of lands and spaces they're talking about, and that view of it didn't change when the Sigurdos and those sorts started pushing it back. There was still land that was outside of society. It was still from this kind of Western white settler perspective. And so when you go from trying to cultivate to protect, the same group of people that is being pushed out and pushed onto reservations, removed from this land, that process doesn't stop. That process continues, right? And so that's one of the issues when we talk about the kind of creation of wilderness. It was this evolution of wilderness. And even though wilderness changed to mean many different things, and it changed again, it continues to ongoing change, the colonial basis for it, the basis that puts it as something separate from civilization, separate from society, separate from our everyday lives, but also as a place that is home to entire nations of people. That's kind of one of the roots of the problem. Why when we talk about the creation of wilderness, it comes with a cost.
Mm-hmm. And so who is it that, for like the boundary waters, that would, in your perspective, like land goes back to? Because Ojibwe people are here.
Yeah.
Like that's what the ceded territory is. There are 3 reservations, Grand Portage, Fond du Lac, Bois Forte, that have this the right to access that land,
Right.
hunt, fish, and gather, and so forth. It's a treaty guaranteed right.
Mm-hmm.
But before Ojibwe people, Dakota people were here, and Dakota, I believe.
Yeah,
were here,
Dakota.
and Ojibwe people came from the east.
Yep.
And pushed them out. So how does that displacement factor into this?
Yeah, I mean it's an important question, and it gets to the question of what does indigeneity mean, which is a lot larger actually than what I talk about in the book. So I'd give there's another couple ways I want to answer that. One is, for me, when I'm talking about in the book and I'm talking about kind of political commitments, I'm talking about treaties, right? And the treaties were made at the time of contact between between white people and Native Americans, but a United States expansion into Minnesota territory, with the Ojibwe in the north and with the Dakota in southern Minnesota. Mm-hmm. So if we're talking about these political commitments and fulfilling treaty rights, that means the Ojibwe. That means the Ojibwe in northern Minnesota, from that legal perspective.
Yeah.
But we think about indigenous, what it means to be indigenous, right? And what this longer history. We can think about and this is a question that's been picked up by indigenous scholars here in Minnesota, across the United States. The thinking about, is indigeneity about being aboriginal to the land, about coming from the space, and yes, it is, but there is of course movement. There is complicated histories with pre-settlement as well, or is indigenous a worldview, a way of relating to the land that is in somehow quantitatively or qualitatively different than kind of a settler or an American relationship to land. Mm-hmm. And so for a lot of indigenous scholars and indigenous activists, that question of land back is instead not a question of decolonization, but a question of indigenization, right? We can't turn the clock back. We can't go back to some pre-colonial time period. We are where we are. And so what does moving forward mean? And so this term of indigenization is one that comes up. And this is something that is, obviously every nation there's huge diversity, there's huge different ways of management, different ways of relating to land, different kind of spiritual connections, different practices, but trying to come up with something that binds a lot of these nations together is a way of relating to land, and then taking that way of relating to land and bring it into the kind of policy that we have in the United States, right? And so a lot of times we think about reciprocity, right? So we take a lot from the land. What is our responsibility to give back to the land? What is our responsibility to protect the land? Respecting the land, building a relationship with the land. What does that mean? It means getting to know it. It means knowing the plants and animals. It means spending time in it. It means if you're recreating in a space, it isn't just going in where man stays and doesn't remain. It's going in learning about the land, right, and building commitments to the land in certain ways. What does that look like in policy? I don't know. But there's folks that are working on that and thinking about that, right? How can we have a more just land management in the United States? Land back is a way that a lot of people want to approach that, especially Indigenous activists. But indigenization of these processes is one way to do that, and that's one way that kind of avoids these kind of real complex questions of, is it Ojibwe land, is it Dakota land, is it Cree land, who was here before that, who was here after that, and saying it's not about who was here, it's about how we relate to the land in a sustainable and just way.
Mm. And because I think that some people are going to be threatened by these ideas
right.
that you propose and that other scholars and so forth are suggesting and exploring right now, and maybe not under the current administration where some of this has a path forward at this time, but that's one administration.
Mm-hmm.
Sentiments change,
yeah.
administration change, Department of Interior administrators change, and Department of Ag and so forth. So it's not just now.
Right.
This moment in time. This book that you wrote could be reviewed in 50 years and looked back on as like, man, this Joe dude from Minnesota, he was the forward thinker on some of this stuff, or he put this idea of wildernessing out there, and it becomes like a ideology of some kind. Like, that's how this starts. It starts somewhere, and so for that alone, I think it's very commendable that you put this out there into the world, and you wrote this. I mean, it got my attention in a big way, man. And not just me, some other people I know that are very passionate about the boundary waters. And what's been the response from the public or other people?
Yeah.
Like, are you getting some heat on any of this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say different audiences have different responses.
Okay.
But I would say anger is a not uncommon response.
Okay.
And the anger is from folks who are most committed to these issues. People who have really dedicated their lives or their identities to protecting wilderness spaces, who see themselves as very, who see themselves as already just, already having a just relationship with the land, right? But for some of the folks I've talked to that start out with anger, it's more about complicating that relationship, right? It's not about, I need to throw up all my ideologies about wilderness. It's like, I already have a commitment to having a relationship with land, and there's this history that I didn't consider, and there's this complication that I didn't consider, and it has to do with not protecting it from necessarily extraction. Like, that still needs to be done. It doesn't mean protecting it, from these other uses. I mean, all those things are still important, but understanding one's own complicity in that, and all this saying, it's like, oh, me as a recreator, me as a wilderness advocate, I am also complicit in these colonial processes. I am also complicit in having essentially an extractive relationship to land, right? Because I'm going in there, in just taking what the land gives to me without kind of honoring my commitment back, or at least having thought about it in that kind of deep way. And so it's,
because how would they give back? Like,
yeah,
how would a outfitter on a gunflint trail give back?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think some of them do in ways where it's like where they're advocating for protections. Mm-hmm. They are training people to respect the land in certain ways. I know, like, in the boundary waters, when you go, you have to take a leave no trace, like video to at least
Sure.
know what the basics are to be able to do that. But because of this, the systems that are kind of upheld through these businesses are still contributing to these ongoing injustices. To truly give back would be to advocate for new systems, right? To say, like, we need to actually rethink about what this land's relationship with the tribes are. We need to rethink about what this relationships to humans are. And the difficulty is that threatening to the very kind of basis of these businesses as
How
wilderness.
they make a living. These
Right.
people are making a living.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But people have changed in the past, right? I mean, the creation of wildernesses was hugely detrimental to many organizations, and it was what we think of as natural today was not uncontroversial at the time.
It was extremely controversial.
I mean, all the businesses that were forced out of the boundary waters to begin with, to create the boundary waters, I don't think folks today would say, oh, we shouldn't have done anything because it would have affected those businesses, or we shouldn't have done anything because maybe if we take out that tourism businesses, then mining is going to come in eventually because there's not that kind of economic commitment in these spaces. Today, we see 50 years later that it actually has protected it in specific ways, and that people have built different kinds of relationships to the same spaces that they would have had before. And my hope is that 50 years down the road, we can have another transition that is one that is more acknowledging of our commitments and of our histories.
Okay. Well, this book came into my possession in Ely. Someone gave it to me, and that was in early July. I was telling Carl from earlier in our conversation, not the fastest read, but I read it a lot and slowly and multiple times, like back through and so forth. And when I reached out to you to see if you'd come on the podcast, I didn't hear anything for a couple days, and it's like, well, he's a busy guy. He's got this new book out, and he's doing his thing with the book. I know how it goes. Not reading too much into no response, and then I hear back from you maybe 3-4 days later, and you're like, hey, Joe, I've been on a canoe trip in the Boundary Waters.
Right.
So a little bit of street cred there kind of going on. You were went up the Granite River up from Gunflint to Sag and so forth, and so you were out in the Boundary Waters,
right.
and now you came up here, and we got to spend some time talking about some of these ideas that you shape in the book, and I think that in conclusion, it's like, to go back to this land is your land, is that there are some verses that are like removed from that, basically, including during Jennifer Lopez when she's singing it at the Biden administration, and in the North Face commercial and so forth, where it's like Woody Guthrie actually raises the question of, is this our land, or whose land is, like, wait a minute, and he's looking at his people he's most akin to or feels connected to, his brothers and sisters at the mission waiting for food handouts in a line, and he's asked a question about the land, and I think more popularly the no trespassing thing also gets a little played up, these days too, a little bit, but like, the idea of public lands, there's a lot of push for it right now, advocacy for these are our lands, public lands, they're important to the soul of America and who we are, and you are one of the first people that I've read and talked to in a while that is willing to go out into a different part of that box and look at it a different way, and I really admire that, Joe, and so thank you for coming up here and having this conversation. The book, Marketing the Wilderness, Joe Whitson, and we've been talking with him on the podcast today around the campfire here after doing some paddling up the Gunflint Trail today. So thanks a lot, Joe, for coming up here. Really
thanks, Joe. This was great to have these conversations, and even if there's people pushing back or having disagreements, I think opening the conversations, I think, is an important start in any change. So
yeah, good. I'm just going to get up. I'm not putting this in the fire.
Okay. And to conclude, And
here's the book, so check this out.